AP 120, Chapter 13, Topics, Cardiac Cycle and Cardiac Conduction System. So the cardiac cycle is the actual beating of the heart, the various contractions and relaxation of muscle tissue within the heart organ. The cardiac cycle begins with the atria contracting, so both atria, right and left, contracting at the same time. That's called the atrial systole. That sends blood into the ventricles. Then the ventricles contract together, so both the right and left ventricles contract, sending blood up into the veins, and that is called the ventricular systole. And then the entire heart is relaxed, and that is called the diastole. And then we just keep repeating that cycle. Atrial systole, then ventricular systole, then diastole. Atrial systole, then ventricular systole, then diastole. On and on, the beating of the heart. So the atria will fill with blood during diastole. As the blood fills, the atria will begin to become higher in blood pressure because there's more blood in them. And during this time, about 70% of the blood passes through the atrioventricular valves into the ventricles. Then the atria both contract, so again, atrial systole. The increased pressure forces the remaining blood into the ventricles. And this is because the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. So this is a pressure gradient. So materials are going to move from where there's high pressure to where there's low pressure. So higher pressure in the atria sends the remaining blood into the ventricles. High pressure, low pressure. And that is atrial systole. Then the ventricles will contract. So as the ventricles contract, this dramatically increases the pressure within the right and left ventricles. At the same time, the atrioventricular valves are going to close. So the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve both close, preventing blood from going into the atria. So the atria are no longer an option, so the blood ends up rushing into the veins, either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. Again, high pressure in the ventricles, low pressure in the veins, going from high pressure to low pressure. And that, of course, is the ventricular systole. And then the ventricles will relax. The ventricles are relaxed, the atria are relaxed. This, of course, would be diastole. Pressure has dropped within the ventricles. The semilunar valves now close. The blood will try to flow back into the ventricles, but instead they will fill the pockets of the semilunar valves, closing the valves, preventing the blood from backing up into the ventricles. So now we have a fully relaxed heart. The pressure in the atria that are filling with blood is greater than in the ventricles, so again, blood will start to pour from the atria into the ventricles, and we just continue the cycle around and around again. The sounds of the heart, that lub-dub sound, well, it turns out those are caused by the closing of the valves. The lub-dub is the closing of the atrioventricular valves, followed by the closing of the semilunar valves. So the first sound, the lub, is when the ventricles start to contract and the tricuspid and bicuspid valves close to prevent the blood from going into the atria. So that is the lub sound, closing of the bicuspid and tricuspid valves. Then the second sound, the dub, occurs when the ventricles relax and the blood starts to backflow and closes the semilunar valves. So the second sound, the dub, is caused by the closing of the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So lub-dub, closing of the atrioventricular valves, then the closing of the semilunar valves. Now, because these are the sounds of valves closing, it's possible for a a healthcare provider to notice abnormal sounds when the heart is beating, and that's referred to as a heart murmur. So abnormal sounds of the heart as it's beating is called a heart murmur, and it is caused by damage to the valves. The valves are not closing properly, and that's causing the modified sound. And as a matter of fact, if the healthcare provider is really experienced at listening to these sounds, they can even determine which of the four valves is suffering an issue. All right, the cardiac conduction system. Cardiac conduction system is the movement of electric current, aka the cardiac muscle action potential, through the walls of the heart, causing the contraction of the atria and the ventricles. So cardiac conduction system is basically the heart's own personal nervous system, moving that cardiac impulse, that muscle action potential through the walls of the heart, specifically the myocardium, where the cardiac muscle tissue is present. So it starts in the sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node is found in the wall of the right atrium, and that generates the muscle action potential that gets sent to the right and left walls of the atria. The sinoatrial node is the generating site, the starting site of these cardiac impulses, and so is often called the natural pacemaker. And actually, when someone gets an artificial pacemaker, it's to help regulate the function of the sinoatrial node, because for whatever reason, in those individuals, it's not functioning properly. So again, the signals spread to both the right and left atria, causing them to contract. Again, this is the atrial systole. And the muscle action potential arrives at the atrioventricular node. This is the node leading to the ventricles, and the signal is paused slightly. So there's a brief pause in the transmission of the cardiac impulse into the ventricles. Then the muscle action potential travels down through the interventricular septum along structures called the atrioventricular bundles. The signal then arrives at the apex of the heart, at the inferior end of the heart, and then spreads into smaller structures called Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers, modified nervous neurons. And these innervate the walls of the ventricles and the papillary muscles. And so this is when you get the contraction of the ventricles together at the same time, the ventricular systole, and also the contraction of the papillary muscles, which helps to make sure that the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are closed properly. Again, the muscle action potential travels through the atrioventricular bundles to the apex of the heart, and then into the Purkinje fibers that cause the ventricles and the papillary muscles to contract at the same time. So again, cardiac conduction system starts with the sinoatrial node, sends the muscle action potential into the atria, causing the walls of the atria to contract. Signal also goes into the atrioventricular node, where there is a slight pause. Then the signal is sent on through the atrioventricular bundles in the interventricular septum, travels down to the apex of the heart, and then is spread through Purkinje fibers into the walls of the ventricles, causing the ventricles to contract. That is the cardiac conduction system. And this is, of course, self-exciting. It is a type of autorhythmicity, so the brain is not necessary to cause the heart to beat. It is not necessary. As a matter of fact, here is a video to prove that. So using a machine to help stimulate the beating of a real human heart. So here's the human heart for transplant. Here is a specialized machine for transporting the heart with blood being piped through it. And as you can see, as soon as blood enters the atria, that is the stimulus causing the heart to beat. No brain is needed at all to get a beating heart. Pretty amazing. All right, we can actually detect the current traveling through the tissues of the heart. And this can be charted on a graph paper and is referred to as an electrocardiogram. So this shows the movement of the charge of the muscle action potential through the muscle tissue of the heart. So it starts off with this small bump. This is the P wave. The P wave is when we have the depolarization of the atria. This is when the atria are contracting. Then we have what's known as the Qrs complex. The Qrs complex is when the ventricles are depolarizing. So this is when the ventricles are contracting, sending blood into the veins. And then we have the T wave, which is when the ventricles repolarize and relax. So we have the contraction of the atria, the contraction of the ventricles, and then the relaxation of the ventricles. Lub-Dub, Lub-Dub, as it were. And this pattern is expected for people who are having a healthy heart beating, but when this pattern is disrupted or altered in some way, in terms of the intervals between the P, the QRS, and the T, or the sizes of them, or so on, this can give the healthcare professional information as to what sort of heart problems the patient may be experiencing. Electrocardiogram. And here is a view of the heart contracting with the movement of the electric charge through the heart, as well as the electrocardiogram underneath. So you can see atriosystole, ventricular systole, atriosystole, ventricular systole, and so on. All right, regulation of the cardiac cycle. Again, while the heart causes the beating all on its own, our brain is able to regulate the speed and power of those heart beats. So this can affect the amount of blood pumped into the heart and through the heart to make sure that the amount of blood being pumped meets the needs of the body. So the heart is, of course, innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and there is receptors detecting both the power of the heart beating and the level of oxygen in the blood and so on, allowing the nervous system to speed up or slow down the heart and cause the heart to beat more powerfully or less powerfully. And again, sympathetic division increases heart rate and strength of contractions. Parasympathetic division decreases heart rate and the strength of the contractions. And they are controlled via the cardiac control center found in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is able to control the rate of heart beating, and the medulla oblongata is receiving information from baroreceptors, receptors within the walls of the large arteries that are detecting changes in blood pressure. And then, of course, other structures in the brain can also affect the cardiac control center and the pace of the heart's beating, including the cerebrum and the hypothalamus. So our emotions, if we get angry or scared or stressed, can affect, or relaxed and calm, can affect how fast or slow the heart beats. That is it for this portion.